Hello everyone, my name is Jennifer Glasgow. I'm a doctoral student in anthropology at McGill University. So I'll just jump right into my presentation. As I said before, I'm at the end of my second year in PhD studies in the Department of Anthropology at McGill University, and I'm going to be starting my fieldwork in Kenya in September. So the talk I'd like to give today is really a condensed version of my research proposal, which, as you'll see, really centers around Maasai youth strategies in terms of moving towards adequate income and livelihoods that are acceptable to them. But this work builds on a long involvement since my master's and previously with John on the land tenure study in East Africa. And I've become convinced that giving a specific lens and window onto the opinions and strategies of youth can really be revealing about larger social and cultural transformations happening there at the moment. So essentially this is my major research question. What strategies do young Maasai men and women use to work towards goals of adequate livelihoods and social adulthood? And there's certainly, we can discuss what I mean when I say livelihood or how I want to use the term youth, but first just to zoom out a little bit, and this is probably old news for some of you, but Africa is the world's most youthful continent, with 76% of the population under the age of 35 in 2010. This fact alone, I think, as well as the kind of demographic dominance of young people in the developing world, makes youth a compelling group to focus on in many parts of Africa. As we know, youth is a very kind of up in the air term. As a group across Africa, certainly youth are very difficult to pin down. Scholars are in agreement that you cannot reduce the term youth to a set of age ranges. And there have been a lot of really interesting studies showing how the social meaning of youth in terms of the length of time it occupies in life has both expanded in a lot of cases across Africa, where economic hardship makes it take longer and longer to be able to marry, start your own household, get a job, and also situations where it's contracted in cases of HIV/AIDS orphans or child soldiers, or in other cases where very young people take on adult responsibilities. And also young people across Africa are kind of noted in the literature and anthropology anyways for their prominence in being touched by forces of globalization and by using transnational strategies of agency that go beyond national borders in terms of looking for empowerment. I'll talk in a second about why this is a key historic juncture for studying youth in Kenya. But just briefly, they passed a new constitution in 2010, which, and I'll just briefly summarize, has some very, very promising text regarding youth. One of my interests is to see how/if this nice text resonates or is being implemented on the ground at all. But the major achievements for youth in this constitution are that they are designated by the state as a vulnerable group. And other vulnerable groups include women, people with disabilities, members of minority ethnic groups, but youth are there as a vulnerable group. And that the state will ensure that measures are taken, including affirmative action programs, to get youth access to relevant education and training, have opportunities to associate, be represented, and participate in political, social, economic, and other spheres of life, and to access employment. And sorry, I'm quoting from the Constitution right now. And finally, that there are 12 seats designated in the National Assembly now that are to be designated for said vulnerable groups, so including youth, women, people with disabilities. Additionally, there's a new government that was just elected peacefully in March of this year, which has brought a lot of new faces into all levels of regional and county government, and a lot of younger faces. So this is just a graph of global median age. We can see that in Africa it's between 14 and 20. And this is an idea of this youth bulge phenomena that we hear about all the time, showing that over the next, so this is 2010 to 2050, the proportion of people in Africa who are young or under the age of 35 is going to keep increasing. So why study Maasai youth specifically is a question I get a lot. And this really relates to the theme of the panel, which is strategic voices. And I think we can see Maasai youth as, and many people would say you can see them as a further marginalized subsect of Kenyan youth. So Maasai pastoralists have had a historically distant relationship with the state. They were very difficult to subdue, both by colonial governments and then after independence by the Kenyan government, due in part to their mobility. They had a reputation of being very defensive about being taken over by outside forces. As a result, today in Maasai land, levels of basic infrastructure are considerably lower than you would find in areas inhabited by other ethnic groups. There's also an ongoing perception of pastoralism or animal husbandry as a livelihood as outdated and kind of backwards or something that needs to be modernized. When in fact, the livelihood has been shown repeatedly in the academic literature and in common sense to be the most productive way to use the arid rangelands of Kenya and other areas in Africa. But there is this kind of popular narrative that goes around about the need to modernize, the need to bring pastoralists more in step with the state system. And there's a long history of kind of government and development interventions in Maasai land that turn out to be less helpful than they were intended. A major one being group ranch creation or forced commercialization of ranches. So you can really, if we accept the premise that Maasai pastoralists have been marginalized by the state, and you combine that with the fact that youth across Kenya are designated as a vulnerable group, you can make the case that Maasai pastoralist youth are a specifically, they're a specific group whose voice is not as heard in national debate. There's also an interesting trend currently of growth and diversification in livelihoods. This is a really interesting moment in the two field sites, which I'll tell you about. There's been a long documentation, including work by Professor Galati, showing that pastoralists are diversifying the ways they make money without abandoning animal husbandry. So it's still important. So these are my two field sites. I'll just show you maps briefly. So I'm going to be working in two towns in Kajiado district, which is one of two predominantly Maasai districts in Kenya. The other is Narok, just to the northwest. Within Kajiado district, so one of my field sites will be Elengatawas, which is highlighted, where I did my master's fieldwork. The other, sorry that I didn't highlight it, is about 3 lines above Elengatawas, and I need a pointer, but it's called Olchoro Nyori. And it's, the two sites differ very widely in terms of, first you can tell that Olchoro Nyori, being farther north, is much closer to the capital of Nairobi. As a result, has much greater pressure on land from expanding urban sprawl of the city. Olchoro Nyori privatized land much earlier than Elengatawas, so you have smaller family sizes. And the general proximity to the capital has meant that they also have slightly better infrastructure in terms of education. So you have higher education rates for youth. And these are just a couple of pictures to give you an idea. This is the town center of mile 46 in Elengatawas Group Ranch, where I'll be doing part of my fieldwork. It's a rapidly expanding, bustling town center, much as it doesn't look overly huge at the moment. There's lots to come. So these are, in essence, my research questions. First of all, before I decide on looking at strategies, I'm interested to know how youth identities are constituted today. And an important element of this is how youth is, how young women experience being youth, as well as young men. I really aim to keep an equality in research subjects through my methodology that would allow me to look at the experiences of young women and how they define youth versus young men, And that's an area that's really been kind of lacking to date in the literature on African youth. And then perhaps the main thrust, what are the current and aspirational forms of youth livelihoods? And so this would be addressed through a livelihoods and employment survey. And beyond, what are youth currently doing to make money? What would they like to do to make money? I'm also interested in where are they going and traveling to make money. Third, how are social support networks constituted? Who do youth rely on? And finally, how do concerns in my specific field sites resonate or articulate or interact with more national or regional level discourses around youth empowerment? So that would be where a national constitution ties in. How do youth in my field site talk about wanting the constitution to be implemented compared to those in other places? And finally, this is kind of my last section and where I'm very interested to hear thoughts or feedback. Why I think this is important, both academically and practically. I'm trying to follow in the footsteps of another anthropologist, Deborah Durham, who's done significant work with youth groups, specifically choirs in Botswana. And her main theoretical contribution is that she wants to look for youth agency in arenas that would typically be seen as kind of everyday scenarios, or youth being apathetic. A long history in the literature on youth in Africa has focused on youth in violent political uprisings, youth as hooligans in urban centers, specifically victimized youth. And agency has often been linked to active struggle. And so I'm interested in widening the field of interpretation for agency to take into account social negotiations, age group negotiations, strategic use of various types of institutions, to really see how agency is expressed in the everyday. And part of the benefit of taking a wider field of interpretation for agency is that you can bring young women into the picture. If you're looking for agency in overt confrontation or struggle or typical paths of kind of institutional advancement, especially in Maasai land where education levels for women are lower, employment levels are lower, you would miss young women altogether. But it's not the case that women aren't expressing agency. There are a huge exploding network of various insurance savings groups, religious political youth groups, political youth groups that women are very active in. So I really want to uncover that. And then kind of a secondary theoretical contribution will be, again, working to overcome these dichotomous narratives around youth that are very focused on, you see it in the literature in sociology, which really talks about if you have this many unemployed youth in your country, you're much more likely to have civil unrest. And that literature, while completely valid, has led to some kind of stereotypical labels on African youth. So you have victims or vandals or vanguards. And there are a couple of very great collected volumes that use those stereotypical labels in their titles. So I'd like to contribute to bringing a more diverse set of descriptors to African youth, and specifically to youth who are seen as being specifically marginalized within the state. So I do want to look at agency, but it's important to point out as well that I don't want to champion agency and ignore the fact that there are serious structural constraints that youth are under. There's a recent work by Marie-Nathalie Leblanc and Muriel Gomez-Perez that puts it very nicely. They speak often about negotiations on the part of youth between an existing structure, which in Maasai land can be very constraining, but their focus is on the ways that youth wiggle in between the structure or the constraints. And there always are cases where, for example, a colleague, Caroline Archambault, has written extensively on situations where young women who are in arranged marriages are able to use their social contacts to leave their family or negotiate a way out of it. And so you have these large narratives of victimization, but there always are exceptions. So I'd like to find a balanced perspective. And then finally, something that I think will make this project very relevant to the literature on pastoralism and the future of Maasai culture in Kenya is that by looking at how youth are incorporating livestock husbandry and pastoralism and use of customary institutions such as age group and age grade structures in finding a livelihood and an income that's satisfactory for them, I think it will really shed light on and my hypothesis is that it will shed light on the continued kind of dynamism and importance of Maasai cultural institutions and livelihood, livestock husbandry to Maasai youth, which would suggest then that this will be a continuing important part of Kenya's cultural landscape for years to come. And so this can hopefully lead to informing policy that will support what pastoralist youth are already doing to empower themselves, whether through social negotiations, through various types of youth groups, rather than interventions that seek to fundamentally change pastoralism or divert youth into completely different forms of employment, leaving behind